Good morning. Glad you're here with us today. We're continuing our series called Parables, and what we've been doing is just simply studying the parables Jesus tells in Matthew chapter 13 and learning what we can, what he's teaching about the kingdom of heaven. So if you've got your Bible with you, go ahead and open up to Matthew chapter 13. We're going to start in verse 44 today, and today we're learning about how valuable the kingdom is. And Jesus tells us the kingdom is worth it. 2 years ago, Amanda and I were shopping for a new guitar. She had been hired here a few months before, and she already had a guitar that had been with her through high school and college, and it was pretty obvious that it had run its course, and she needed something a little more durable. And so one day we went out guitar shopping, and she had looked at guitars ahead of time online. For probably about the month before that, she had been looking at different brands of guitars and the different lines that each brand offered and what each guitar was supposed to do. And as we went to these stores, she was trying out different guitars. And Kevin Lane was with us, and he kept saying, "You'll know. Like, when you find the guitar, you'll know." And so we had set a price limit, hoping against hope that there was a guitar that would be at or below that limit. And she tried all the guitars within our limit, and none of them were doing it for her. And so she picked up one that was well above the limit we had set, and she set it in her lap, she tuned it up, strummed it once. And when I saw the look on her face, I knew I was going to spend more money than I had planned on spending that day, okay? She had found it, and I knew she was going to do whatever it took to take that guitar home that day because she found it, and it brought her joy, and it was worth it. 2 weeks ago, I took a couple senior high guys down to Joplin with me, Bradley and Ruben. He's smiling, yeah. We went down to Joplin together to my school, Ozark Christian College, for a senior high conference. And we had a little bit of spare time the first night, so when we got there, we went to Vintage Stock, and there's one here in the mall. But if you haven't been to the Vintage Stock in Joplin, you really haven't been to Vintage Stock, because the one in Joplin is just this massive warehouse of used video games and movies and comic books and collectibles. So we went in there, and we're walking around, and all of a sudden I see this 6-foot-tall cardboard cutout of Batman. Now, for the story to make sense, you need to know that I kind of like Batman a little. Okay, so I see this cutout, and before I think or say or do anything else, I just say, "I'm getting it." Like, that was my first, I'm getting it. And Bradley can tell you, he was there. I checked with my superior. She said yes. But I got to tell you, even if she hadn't, I was getting that Batman, okay? Because it was worth it. It was worth the financial cost, and it was worth whatever emotional cost I might have had to pay when I brought it home. I found it, it brought me joy, and it was worth it. And Jesus says that the kingdom of heaven is like that. You should be in Matthew chapter 13 by now. Our verses for today are verses 44 through 46. I'm going to read the whole thing, and then we'll break it down and look at the parables within. Starting in verse 44, Jesus says, "The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field. When a man found it, he hid it again, and then in his joy went and sold all he had and bought that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant looking for fine pearls. When he found one of great value, he went away and sold everything he had and bought it." There are two parables we're going to look at today, the parable of the hidden treasure and the parable of the pearl. And the first one we're going to look at is the parable of the hidden treasure, and this is in verse 44. And Jesus says, "The kingdom of heaven." And in our passage today, when we're talking about the kingdom of heaven, Jesus is talking about entering the kingdom. He's talking about how people receive the gospel. "Is like treasure hidden in a field." Now, back in this time, it was common to bury your valuables, whether it was money, jewelry, food, clothing, whatever was important to you, you would put it in a jar or in a box and bury it underground. And they would do that for protection. There were no banks. There were no safes. Okay? So you had to do something to protect your stuff from thieves that would come in and try to steal it, or if an army was invading and coming through the land, you didn't want them to get your valuables. So they would put it underground, and it would be left buried until it was reclaimed. So if you needed money, or you were going to sell something or trade something, you would wait till nighttime and go and dig it up and then bury it again so no one sees where it is. Well, sometimes the owner would die or would be forced to leave, and so the treasure just stayed there until there was a lot of stuff buried under the ground. And so it says, Jesus says, when a man found it, now this isn't like, there's no treasure map, okay? There's no pirate map. This isn't a guy with his metal detector out there looking for treasure. I mean, they didn't find it that way. Either he sees part of it sticking up, or he trips over it when he's walking through the field, or he's digging and accidentally digs it up. Somehow, a man accidentally finds this treasure, and when he did, he hid it again, and then in his joy, went and sold all that he had and bought that field. Now, we think Jesus is talking about a dishonest man. We think he's being sneaky, right? Like if he found treasure on somebody's property, he needs to tell the owner of the property because that's their treasure. Well, no, he's not being dishonest here. First of all, that's not the point of the parable, but also he's not being dishonest, okay? If this was the owner's treasure, the owner would not have sold the field to the man with the treasure still in it, right? He would have gone and gotten his treasure first and then sold the field. So obviously this stuff doesn't belong to the owner any more than it does to the man who found it. Also, the rabbis had this rule that was basically finders keepers because there was so much of this treasure underground. They said if you found it and the owner's dead or he's not there anymore, it's yours. You can have it. And also, the man doesn't pocket some of the treasure and then use that to buy the field. He hides it all again, goes and sells all that he has, and then buys the field, knowing he's going to have to use some of that treasure to buy all of his stuff back. So he's not being dishonest here, that he's being perfectly honest. But again, that's not the point. The point is, it costs him everything. He sacrifices all that he has to get this treasure. Let's move on and talk about our second parable, the parable of the pearl. And this is in verses 45 through 46. Jesus says, again, the kingdom of heaven. And once more, when he's talking about the kingdom here, he's talking about entering the kingdom, getting into it, receiving the gospel. And this time he says, it's like a merchant looking for fine pearls. And a merchant was a trader, a dealer. He was someone who would buy something and then go and sell it somewhere else for a higher cost, kind of providing goods and services. And he was looking for pearls, and a pearl was the ancient equivalent of a diamond. It was the most valuable gemstone in the ancient world. They were beautiful, they were rare, they were hard to get. They were often bought as investments. A very small amount of wealth could be kept in a single pearl. So they were the ancient equivalent of diamonds, and when the merchant finds one of great value, now, again, we're talking about him finding something. When I wanted to find a gemstone ring for Amanda, I went to Zales. Okay, back then there was no Zales. There was no Shane Company, all right? This guy was the Shane Company, okay? If you wanted like a pearl or a gemstone, you had to go to a merchant who had it. And when Jesus is talking about finding it, he's not just walking along the seashore and there's a pearl. This guy had to travel. He had to go to the places where the pearls were. He had to go to the coastal areas. He had to go to different countries. He had to barter. He had to haggle. And so he's working hard and looking for this pearl. And he finally found it. And when he did, Jesus says he went away and sold everything he had and bought it. So again, we see it costs him everything. This man sacrifices all that he has to get this pearl. So let's compare these parables, play with them a little bit. The main character is pretty similar. They're both men. Both of these men find something of great value, and then they sacrifice all they have for it. But they find it differently. And remember, we're talking about how people enter the kingdom, how people receive the gospel, and the way these men find their treasure is the way we enter the kingdom. So the first man, he finds it accidentally. This is the guy who found the treasure in the field, wasn't looking for it. This is like how I found my Batman, okay? I did not go to vintage stock to buy a cardboard cutout of Batman. We just went to hang out, and then I just kind of ran into it, and I got it. And this man does the same thing. And this is how some of us receive the gospel. Whether we grew up in the church or not, we're just going about our normal business, not really looking for anything extra, just kind of going to work, raising our families, looking out for ourselves, and all of a sudden you had a conversation with somebody, or you heard a sermon on the radio, or you heard a sermon on TV, or you read something, and it was kind of like you found Jesus that way. All of a sudden, there he was, there was the gospel, you received it, and it just happened. That can even happen to you when you're raised in church, right? You go to church every week because that's what you've always done, and you hear the same stories as you're growing up, and then all of a sudden, it's like, okay, you go to church just like any other day, but then all of a sudden, it's like you find Jesus. Like all of a sudden, you take a personal interest, and it becomes real for you, and we just find him accidentally. That's like the first man. But the second man finds it deliberately. This is the guy who's looking for pearls, and he's looking and searching and buying and trading. And this is how Amanda bought her guitar. She was looking ahead of time, shopping online, going to guitar stores, trying out different guitars, actively searching for it and finding it. And this is how others of us receive the gospel and enter the kingdom. We're researching different religions, researching different philosophies, trying them out, nothing works, and then finally we hear about Jesus and the gospel and salvation, and it makes sense, and we find it, and we receive it. So these two men really show us how people receive the gospel. And as we're looking at them now and trying to see what we can learn from it, I think there's a few challenges from these parables for us. And as I've prayed for this sermon and prepared for this sermon, the Holy Spirit's really been challenging me with a couple questions throughout the week. And so that's what I'm going to ask you today, and we're going to see what challenges these parables have for us. And the first question is this: how much is Jesus worth to you? How much is Jesus worth to you? To these men in the parables, obviously he was worth everything, and we're kind of challenged to see how much he means to us too. Is he worth your commitment? Is Jesus worth your commitment to belong to him and be like him and bring others to him for the rest of your life? Is he worth you making that commitment public and known by coming before the church and confessing your belief in him and being baptized? Is Jesus worth your lifelong commitment? Is Jesus worth the strife he will bring into your life? Is he worth the strife with your spouse because they're not a Christian, or because they are and they don't take Jesus as seriously as you do? Is he worth changing the way you treat your spouse? Is he worth the strife he's going to bring with your parents? Maybe you're a teenager and you're frustrated because your parents won't let you take the risks you want to take. Or maybe you're an adult and your parents are Catholic and they raised you in the Catholic Church and they don't know why you want to be baptized again. Is he worth that? Is Jesus worth the strife you're going to have with your kids? Is he worth changing the way you treat your kids? Is he worth the strife you're going to have because now you won't let them do things they used to do and you're making them do things they've never had to do before? Is Jesus worth the scorn, the mockery, the contempt, the misunderstanding you're going to get from your coworkers, from your friends? Is Jesus worth the suffering of persecution that believers all over the world are suffering and that we ourselves may someday be called on to suffer? Is he worth the sacrifice he's going to ask you to make, the ongoing sacrifices you're going to have to make of money? You're going to have to start giving to the church. You're going to have to start giving to the needy to help them out. Is he worth the sacrifice of lifestyle? You might have to tone down the way you're living to be mindful and helpful to others who have less than you do. Is he worth the time, the energy he's going to ask you to sacrifice? Is Jesus worth denying yourself, your sinful desires, your sinful passions, your sinful habits? Is he worth sacrificing your own dreams and goals for your future? Is he worth laying aside your personal rights, the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness? Is Jesus worth denying yourself? I hope he is. I hope Jesus is worth everything to you. And that, like these men, you're willing to give whatever it takes to get into the kingdom. The second challenge, the second question I want to ask you today is, how much are you willing to offer Jesus? Because there's the initial demands of the gospel, right? And then there's the continual demands. It's not like a one-time sacrifice. You have to sacrifice to get into the kingdom, and then once you're in, there's still more demands. And there's still more sacrifices that have to be made. So now that you're in, how much are you willing to offer Jesus? It's hard to know how much Jesus asks of us, isn't it? I mean, you read the Gospels, and there's times when he tells people to completely leave behind their friends, their family, their finances, sell everything you have and give it to the poor. He says that to some people, but then he doesn't say that to other people. Because they were friends, and while he was traveling, he would stay at their house. So obviously, if he stayed at their house, he didn't ask them to sell their house, but they still supported him and loved him and believed in him. And so it's hard to know kind of where we fall and how much he's asking us to offer him. And I say that because I want to be fair, and I want to consider everything the Gospels say, but then I have to ask, am I justifying myself? Justifying the fact that I don't offer Jesus more? And I think sometimes the reason he doesn't ask is that we don't offer. So think about, have you ever hosted a party or a family reunion at your house? Yeah? And you didn't feel like sending out a whole bunch of personal invitations, so you just sent out one mass invite. You sent out an email, or you talk to your friends and relatives who talk a lot, and you just said, everybody's invited. So just let them know everybody's invited. And then when you do that, what happens? There's always one friend or one relative who doesn't come because... What? Yeah, because you didn't invite me, right? And you're talking to this person, hey, where were you the other night? Why didn't you come? Oh, well, I wasn't invited. Yeah, you were. I invited everybody. What are you talking about? Oh, well, I didn't know because you just didn't invite me. And you're like, all right, you know what? Whatever. You're going to be that way? Fine. I don't care. You don't hate them for it, but they're like, they get at you. And I really hope I'm not going to be that way to Jesus someday. I really hope when we're in heaven, it doesn't go like this. Jesus comes up to me and he says, hey, Zach, you had a lot of stuff. You lived comfortably. Why didn't you offer me more? Oh, well, Jesus, you didn't ask me. Really? Because in the Gospels, I ask people all the time, why did you think it would be different? Because it was you. Oh, well, I just didn't know. You didn't ask me. And I just don't want to be that guy to Jesus. You know what I mean? So I hope that once you've given whatever it takes to get into the kingdom, that you're willing to offer Jesus everything and put all your resources at his disposal, and that you're willing to give whatever it takes to stay in the kingdom. Those are the challenges the parables have for us. We're going to have a time of invitation now. People available to receive you, counsel you, pray with you. If you want to make that initial commitment to get into the kingdom, or if you feel the Holy Spirit prompting you to offer Jesus more, and you're just not sure what that is, we'll have people to receive you, counsel you, pray with you, give whatever it takes to get into the kingdom, and give whatever it takes to stay in the kingdom.